Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Israel Connection. I'm Esti Zenati, and this is our last episode of season 3. My guest today is Yardena Schwartz. She is an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer who was based in Israel for a decade until 2023. Her reporting from 4 continents has appeared in dozens of publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Review, and more. Yardena previously worked at NBC News and MSNBC. She received an Emmy nomination for her work at MSNBC in 2013 and the RNA Award for Excellence in Magazine Reporting in 2016. Yardena's first book, Ghosts of a Holy War, was released in 2024 and has recently been optioned for film. Yardena, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Esti.
So let's start from the very beginning. How has your connection to Israel started? Did you grow up in a household that was very Zionist or connected to Israel, or was it something that you grew up later on, learned about as an adult?
Well, growing up as a young girl, I was religious. My family was religious when I was younger. And so from a young age, I was going to Jewish day school and learning about Israel and history of the Jewish people in Israel. And so from a young age, I had that connection to Israel, but also my mother's sister, so my aunt, had moved to Israel before I was born. She moved there in the early 70s. And so we would often talk to my aunt and my cousins. She had 5 sons, and they would visit us. They would visit the States throughout the year. I didn't go to Israel until I was 18. It was the summer after high school. But already by that time, I knew a lot about Israel and, felt very connected to it. It was never really a question in my home growing up. I mean, we never talked about the politics or anything of that sort, but just in terms of, the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel was just kind of a very baked in part of my life.
Yeah. So how did you, from that, become a journalist later on in your life? And then how did that lead to you spending 10 years in Israel and covering Israel for those outlets that we talked about?
So I always loved writing from a very early age. I kept journals. I still have boxes of them from the time I was 5 years old. And it's really cute because my daughter is now 6 and she has journals too. But I didn't decide I wanted to become a journalist until I was a few years into college. I had thought I would be a teacher, maybe work in diplomacy. And then I studied abroad in Tel Aviv and I became friends with a journalist there. And then when I went back to my undergraduate studies in the States, I just became more interested in journalism and I pursued an internship in news. I worked at ABC News Radio, and then I got an internship at the New York Times covering the New Hampshire primaries in 2008. And from that point on, I was hooked. I just loved it, being out in the field and interviewing people. And so after I graduated from college, I went into news production in TV news. Despite the fact that I never really wanted to work in TV, I really wanted to work in print, but print journalism was doing really bad in 2008.
Yeah.
I think in 2008.
It's getting back now, I feel like.
I know. Yeah. It's
coming back.
Back in 2008, I think we would have thought, okay, 20 years from now, it's definitely just going to be gone. But, that's not the case for sure. But
back.
Yeah. So I went into TV news and, was working at ABC News and then NBC. And then I went to Columbia Journalism School thinking, okay, once I, get my journalism degree, then I can work in print journalism. But again, still, I kind of just got stuck working in TV. I went back to NBC and MSNBC. And finally, I decided, what, if I want to be a print journalist, reporting from overseas, I need to just do that myself and make it happen. So I quit my job at MSNBC, moved to Tel Aviv to become a freelance reporter. And I thought I would just do freelance for maybe a year, maybe two, and then get hired by a newspaper, a magazine. But I just loved freelancing, being independent, choosing the stories I get to write, writing for many different publications. So I've never gone back. I've been independent since 2013.
Wow. So what was that experience like for you, reporting from Israel and being on the ground? Was there anything that kind of maybe changed your perspective on the conflict and everything that was going on, or something that you thought was really important for you to relay the message to people outside? You need people to know what was going on, on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it really changed my perspective because I had always been very balanced, despite the fact that I am Jewish and I come from, a Zionist household. I always had been very sympathetic to Palestinian suffering. And, when my first trip to Israel as a journalist was before I moved there. It was in 2011. And I was touring Israel with my class from Columbia Journalism School. And, we met with Israelis, Palestinians. And I would say that trip probably shook me and changed me more than once I was already living in Israel, because that was my first time looking at Israel from the eyes of a journalist rather than from the eyes of, a girl who had grown up with, Israeli family and all of that. So that probably changed me more than any of the reporting I did once I was already living in Israel. I write about that in the book, actually, about how, the first time I went to Hebron versus what I saw in Hebron once I started writing this book. But I think it just really deepened my understanding of everything that I had already known or thought I knew. And it was really my time in Hebron writing the book that kind of shifted my understanding of the conflict and the way we are talking about it, the way it's spoken about in the media. But as a reporter writing for dozens of American magazines and newspapers, I did see firsthand the way Israel and stories from Israel are treated in a very strange way, because I had reported on other countries, not, I had been living in the US reporting on domestic news here. I spent 6 months in Germany reporting on German politics. And I just found it so jarring the way in which certain stories from Israel or from the Palestinian territories would just not get any interest from any of the dozens of editors I worked with versus stories that always had interest from them. You can probably guess what stories did always interest them. The ones that were, more critical of Israel. I throughout my decade reporting from Israel, I covered Netanyahu and the trial, or well, not the trial, but the charges and the indictment, and just his kind of political maneuvering, and those stories were always very interesting to edit.
Of course.
Like I did a story about the use of administrative detention for Palestinian prisoners. Things like that always had interest. But when it was a story about Palestinians being mistreated by their own government, or Palestinians who were working with Israelis and being, threatened, having their lives threatened for trying to work towards peace, those stories were not interesting to editors. And so sadly, they just never saw the light of day. And so kind of being on the inside of that, it's very easy to see how we ended up where we are today, where, the coverage of Israel and the Palestinians is just it's just so one-sided and so lacking in full context. Really only get an understanding of a tenth of the real story because you're missing all of this other context.
Right. And we see it obviously in the way that it impacts people's views of Israel. And Yeah, like what do you think the role of the media today is in what's happening? All the anti-Israel, commentary online and everywhere else. What do
I
you think
think
like the media's role in this whole thing?
I think the media's role is quite prominent
Mm,
because people's understanding of the world around them comes from, if it's, history, then that understanding comes from history books and classes in school. But when it comes to people's understanding of the world around them now, that is shaped by the media. And if the media is leaving out so much of the truth of a story, and really picking which facts they want to put in a story based on the narrative they're trying to push, then
mhm.
people aren't going to get a full understanding of the issues. And this is one of the most complex, important issues of our time. So it
Yeah.
requires all of that context. It requires that understanding. And it does require a little bit of the history to be infused into these stories. And what I found when I was reporting from Israel and the West Bank, for so many of these news organizations, even just one sentence of historical context was just always taken out.
Mm,
And so I think this is why you have such a massive generational divide on Israel, where people over 50 or 60 have a very favorable view of Israel, while people younger have an extremely unfavorable view of Israel because all they know is what they see now.
yeah.
They did not live through the Second Intifada. They did not live through the various efforts by Israel to share the land, to reach a two-state solution,
Yeah.
and only to see Palestinian leaders refuse those offers. Whereas older people were there, they watched it, they saw it on the news. They or they were alive during the Holocaust or the founding of Israel, and they know how it came to be. Again, with the Arab rejection of two states, the Arab declaration of war. So people who were alive then, or who know this history, usually have a very different perspective of the
Yes. True.
conflict. And younger people who the only understanding they're getting is what they see in the news today. This is why their perspective is so warped.
Yeah, I feel like the younger generation, they kind of remove themselves altogether from the situation, because they're like, oh, it's not about me,
Hmm.
so I have nothing to do with it. So it didn't happen, or it happened, but it doesn't affect my life. That's what it feels like right now and everybody's immersed in social media, and everything is like, they're being fed all these lies and all these, misinformation. Um, yeah, and it's really unfortunate, but you
Yeah.
know, yeah. But yeah, history is very important, and I think people tend to forget about that.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot understand the present without understanding the past.
Mhm.
And everything that's happening now is going to shape the future.
Right.
And in the same sense, everything that is happening today has been shaped by the past. And so without that understanding, not only can you not understand the present, but there's no hope for a better future if we're not
Right.
learning from our past.
So your book, the Ghost of Hollywood, focuses on the 1929 massacre in Hebron, which was a very pivotal moment in history in Israel. How did this book come about, and why did you think that it was an important story that needs to be out there?
So the book came to me in a way because in 2019, I was, doing my thing as a freelance journalist in Tel Aviv when I woke up to an email from Yossi Klein Halevi, one of the best authors writing about Israel today. And he had he had been approached by a family in Memphis, Tennessee. This family had discovered a box of letters in their attic. And those letters, hundreds of pages of them, had been written by their late uncle in the late 1920s, who had moved from Memphis to British Mandate Palestine and had lived in Hebron for 1 year studying at the Hebron yeshiva, which
Mhm.
was at the time the most prestigious yeshiva in the Holy Land. And he wrote to his family every week these beautiful long letters. But David, his name was David Chainberg, he was murdered in the Hebron massacre.
Mhm.
And this family had realized that they were sitting on a treasure trove of history and decided they wanted to find an author who could do something with the letters. And so they approached Yossi, hoping he could do it, and he couldn't for various reasons. But he loved, he just fell in love with those letters and the idea of this book, and wanted to help them find the right person. And I'm so honored that I was the first person he contacted, and I'm so grateful to Yossi and so grateful to the family in Memphis, David Shainberg's descendants, specifically his great niece, Jill Nodowich, who's still in Memphis. The family's still in Memphis, and they're wonderful. And she gave me complete editorial freedom in
Nice.
story, which was incredibly generous of her. She had no, veto power over anything. She was just super supportive of me and my research and the reporting I did over the next 5 years. So from 2019 until 2024, I was researching not just 1929 and what led to the massacre and what followed, but what became very clear to me pretty soon after I started my research was that so much of the conflict today has been shaped and informed by that event in 1929 that is so unknown outside of Israel. I mean, I had never known about it. And I realized in learning about the massacre that it explained so much of what we're seeing today. And that, once you understand what happened in 1929, you see the present in a completely different way. And so much makes sense once so much of this conflict is just incomprehensible and just, makes no sense. Why are we still here? How has this not been solved? And you realize when learning about what happened in 1929, about the massacre, the forces that led to it and the forces that followed, and the people whose incitement and disinformation led to the massacre, and how those people were empowered after the massacre. It's just haunting now, looking at this history post October 7th, because I was writing the book before October 7th. I was about halfway through my manuscript, and I already felt, wow, this is the context we need to understand the conflict today. And then on October 7th, it was essentially the massacre of 1929 was essentially a preview of the horrors of October 7th. Since 1929, there had not been something on that scale to happen to the Jewish community in Israel. And October 7th almost seemed to follow the blueprint for 1929. And so it became just all the more clear to me that the parallels between then and now are the key to not only people understanding this conflict, but to any hopes of resolving it. Because you cannot solve a problem you do not understand. And it has been abundantly clear, especially in the aftermath of October 7th, with so many people around the world justifying the massacre or blaming the victims for the atrocities they suffered. The same thing happened in 1929. And I think, it's a really instructive history lesson in how we got here and what we need to change in order to find a way out of this endless cycle of violence.
Yeah, it's true. And it's sad that people don't know about that massacre, because I read about it more yesterday, but I've obviously learned about it at school because I'm from Israel. We learned about all this, the history and everything at school. But the parallels are very apparent. There were 3,000 terrorists walking into Hebron, walking into houses, murdering, raping, beheading people, and about 67 people, I think, were murdered, women, children, men. And it's very clear that had something to do with October 7th later on.
The causes of the massacre of 1929, what led to this massacre of this peaceful Jewish community in Hebron in 1929 was a disinformation campaign, which claimed that the Jews of Palestine were planning to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque and destroy the mosque in order to rebuild the ancient Jewish temple on the Temple Mount. October 7th was named the Al-Aqsa Flood. I mean, the murderers on August 24th, 1929, that Shabbat morning in 1929, the rioters were shouting Allahu Akbar, praising Islam and claiming to defend Islam and Al-Aqsa from the Jews. I don't know if you've watched the footage from October 7th, but
yes, unfortunately,
the
I have.
most common denominator from all of those hours of video is that they're shouting Allahu Akbar.
Yeah, that's the common thing in every terror attack. And living through it, all the years that I've lived in Israel and all that, that's the common denominator, that they supposedly do it for their God.
Exactly.
Which is not something you're supposed to do, but that's how they look at it from that perspective. And it's scary.
Right. And what was so shocking to me, and what changed my perspective of the conflict was that very fact that they're committing these attacks, not for the reasons we think they are and we're told they are. And even I had thought, before writing this book, you think about it in rational terms or terms we can understand in the West, but they're absolutely doing it because they believe that this is the way to please God, to defend their religion. And when you say this in the West, you're accused of, Islamophobia. But I mean, in their own words, they're saying it.
Yeah.
And this is what I found in my research and also in my interviews with Palestinians in Hebron. When you ask them these questions, they'll tell you. It's just you have to go to ask those questions.
Right.
And I was never asking those kinds of questions. And it's just fascinating. Once you realize the role that religion plays in this conflict, you can't unsee it, because then so everything else makes sense. The fact that they were carrying Qurans in the pickup trucks on October 7th, and were, calling their parents saying, how proud they were of themselves for killing Jews.
Yeah.
When you realize that it's actually revered, and not in Islam in general, but in a jihadist interpretation of Islam, which of course Hamas, follows that jihadist interpretation of Islam, and Hamas's followers. In 1929, that had not been the case at that point. And it was this propaganda, this disinformation campaign that began in 1928, claiming that the Jews of Palestine were a threat to Islam, a threat to Al-Aqsa. This is when that narrative of jihad took hold in the Arab population of Palestine, and it just grew after that. And that was why I named the book Ghosts of a Holy War, because this has always been a holy war from the beginning. This is what the people who have been driving the conflict, that's what it is to them. I mean, when you look at what the Arab leaders said in 1947 when they rejected the UN's vote to partition Palestine, they said this is holy Muslim land and it will always remain Muslim land. The Jews cannot claim this land. It's Islamic. And they used the words, many Arab leaders used the words jihad in their call for their people to rise up and prevent the establishment of a Jewish state. They said, this is jihad, this will be an affront to Islam. And that is still the language being used by so many groups today, whether it's Hezbollah, the Party of Allah, Hamas, the Islamic Resistance Movement, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, Iran. I mean, this is the language they use. And yet the Western world, or particularly the media, will never cover that, will never include that very language in their stories because they're, I think, afraid of being labeled Islamophobic when you're really just, using their own words. You're not. So it's really frustrating to see how many people are just completely unaware of the actual driving forces of this conflict. Because again, I mean, we wouldn't be here if people understood the conflict. We could have solved it long ago if people understood. If the people who are trying to bring peace to this land actually knew what would bring peace, I think we would have reached a peaceful resolution long ago.
Yeah, people need to listen. They need to listen to actual actors in the game. Like this is not something that you interpret, or, like an American lens or whatever it is. You have to listen because it's not the same. This is not Western society. It's a whole different game. And people just tend to overlook that or just completely ignore it and insert their words in it rather than listening to what they're saying. And they're saying it on camera. They're not hiding anything, so it's interesting. I don't know how I don't know how it works. It's just weird to me because like you see it, you hear it, and you still ignore it or deny it completely.
Right.
Yeah. So based on the letters that David wrote, like that sent to his family, what were like the relations, the Israeli-Arab relations before everything happened?
So before the massacre, the Jews and Arabs living in Hebron had really great relationships. At the time, it was considered the safest place to be a Jew in Palestine. Jews and Arabs attended each other's weddings and holiday celebrations. There were about 800 Jews living in Hebron at the time, amongst about 20,000 Arabs. And many of the Jews rented their homes from Arab landlords. Most of the Jews living in Hebron at that time spoke Arabic, even if they were Ashkenazi. About half of the Jews in Hebron at that time were Sephardic or Mizrahi. They'd come from Arabic-speaking countries. But even those who were Ashkenazi, many of them had been there since the 1800s. And so they spoke Arabic and they owned businesses together. Like this wasn't coexistence of today. This wasn't just people living in the same city, but really having kind of separate lives. Like they were really interwoven. But at the same time, Jews in Hebron were essentially second-class citizens. They were a tiny minority. They were a tolerated minority. Jews, for example, in Hebron at the time were forbidden from entering the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, where the forefathers and mothers of the Jewish people are buried. For 700 years throughout Muslim rule, essentially, Jews and anyone who was not Muslim could not enter the tomb of the patriarchs. And so Jews would still pray there, but they had to pray outside. And sometimes young Arabs would, throw rocks at the Jews worshiping below and laugh, or they would curse at the Jews worshiping outside. So, it wasn't perfect, but compared to what Hebron is today, one of the most volatile places in this conflict, an epicenter of this conflict, where so many terrorist attacks occur or emanate from, a place where, the idea of Jews and Arabs coexisting side by side in peace is almost, unfathomable. I mean, Jews and Arabs today do live in Hebron, but
not in peace.
Can only do so because there are hundreds of Israeli soldiers there to protect the Jews living there. So that was obviously not the case in 1929. There were no Jewish soldiers. There was no, there was no state of Israel. This was 2 decades before the state of Israel was born. Palestine at the time was about 20% Jewish. Jerusalem was already a majority Jewish city. But, under British rule, the Ottoman restrictions on Jewish life, so the Muslim restrictions on Jewish life, such as quotas on Jewish immigration, special taxes that Jews had to pay under British rule after the British conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, the British did away with those restrictions. So now the Jewish and Arab subjects of British Mandate Palestine were on equal footing. And this is what awakened so much of that antagonism, that anti-Jewish sentiment that had not really been prominent under the Ottomans because Jews were weak. They were, a tiny minority. There were places they could not buy land. And under the British, Jews could buy land wherever they wanted. They could emigrate. And so this was also a time when many Jews did need to return to their ancient homeland because pogroms and anti-Semitism throughout Europe were, raging. And so that the end of those Ottoman restrictions came at an ideal time for so many of the Jews who had to flee Eastern Europe. This was in the wake of the Kishinev pogrom. What's really interesting to me after I started to research the Hebron massacre was that I think most people know, if you're Jewish, you've heard about the Kishinev pogrom. This is, one of the most notorious pogroms of Eastern Europe, led hundreds of thousands of Jews to flee Eastern Europe. And yet the massacre in Hebron in 1929 was both more deadly and more gruesome and more horrific than the Kishinev pogrom. And it happened in Palestine. And I think it's just, I still don't know why that is. People ask me when I go and speak in different communities about this history and, do book talks, I'm often asked, why don't we know more about this history? And I don't know why. I think, it could be because almost immediately after the Hebron massacre, the stock market crashed, bringing on the Great Depression. This was 1929. Just a few years after that, Hitler rose to power. I think that this massacre was simply eclipsed by so many other massive global upheavals and, the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. And I think also there, and maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's this element of Israeli society and the Israeli psyche that doesn't like to dwell on suffering. We don't like to be victims. There are a lot of cultures in this world who really cherish their victimhood. And, I think when it comes to Holocaust remembrance, it's about remembering and honoring the victims and, teaching to ensure it never happens again. But it's not like this, isn't this pride in being victims. And so I think this idea that Jews were just slaughtered in the land of Israel, in their ancient homeland, where they had just started to return to en masse, that wasn't something that the Jewish people or the people of Israel wanted to really focus on. They wanted to focus on, building up a Jewish state. And that's another thing that I found so interesting in researching my book was I had no idea that before 1929, the Zionist movement was not a very popular concept. Even in the land of Israel. So the old Yeshuv, many of the traditional Jews in the land of Israel, Sephardim, Mizrahim, were not on board with political Zionism. They were Zionists in the religious sense, in the Jewish sense, but they believed that the return of the masses to the land of Israel, the return from exile, should only be through the will of God and the arrival of the Mashiach. And the fact that it was these secular Jews, these godless Jews who were taking up the mantle of returning the Jews to the land of Israel, this was just blasphemous to them. So that was why they didn't embrace it. And because 1929 saw those Jews, those anti-Zionist, defenseless Jews, pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah, living peacefully with their Arab neighbors, whether it was in Hebron or Tzfat, those were the Jews who suffered the most gruesome atrocities and the highest numbers of casualties in these riots in 1929. And that convinced many of those who had until then opposed Zionism that they truly couldn't depend on any foreign power to protect them. The British had proved not only incapable of protecting the Jews of Palestine, but unwilling to do so because they feared that if they protected the Jews, the Arabs would turn their violence against them, against the British. And so many Jews in Palestine at the time realized that no foreign power was going to protect them. They would only be safe in their own country under the protection of their own army. And this is why after 1929, the Haganah became exponentially stronger. It became a bigger fighting force, more centralized and more organized fighting force. And you saw the split from the Haganah into the Irgun. That was also the result of the massacre of 1929, because the Haganah was all about defense and reaction. So, if there's an attack, we will defend. The Irgun kind of rejected that notion of restraint and said, no, we need to prepare actively for these attacks, because we knew that we knew these riots were going to break out, and we didn't do enough proactively. So they decided, this group of Haganah members created the Irgun as a different, military organization that wouldn't be held to restraint. It would retaliate. It would preempt attacks. And I also hadn't known prior to my research in this book, and this was another part of that story of the transformation of Zionism. The Haganah actually came to Hebron before the riots erupted and warned the Jewish leaders of Hebron that there were going to be riots in Jerusalem. They were going to spread throughout Palestine, reach every community. The Jewish community of Hebron would not be spared. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron they refused to believe it. They just could not believe, did not want to believe that their friends and neighbors would turn on them. And they said, no. In years past, when riots erupted elsewhere, or when attacks took place against Jews in Jerusalem or elsewhere, that never happened to us, because our neighbors are our friends. If anything, if people come here from Jerusalem to hurt us, our Arab neighbors will protect us. They were certain. And so they sent the Haganah members away. And it was the Jews of Hebron that suffered more casualties and more horrific atrocities than any other Jewish community in Palestine. So the riots, they actually did start in Jerusalem, just like the Haganah thought they would. They started in Jerusalem on August 23rd, 1929, and they spread throughout Palestine. Jews in Gaza were evacuated by the British. And in Hebron, because they didn't take the advice of the Haganah either wanted to evacuate the Jews of Hebron to Jerusalem to safety, or to Tel Aviv to safety. Jerusalem and Tel Aviv were places where the Haganah was very organized and very present. So despite the fact that the riots broke out in Jerusalem, not many Jews were killed in Jerusalem. And the Haganah actually fought back. And throughout these riots, 133 Jews were killed in a matter of a few days. Approximately 116 Arabs were also killed. Most of those Arabs were killed by the British forces who quelled the riots. But some of them were killed by Haganah members in Jerusalem who were defending Jews from these riots. But in Hebron, there was no protection. The Jews weren't armed. They were just hiding inside their homes, behind doors and windows. The British police chief in Hebron had promised the Jews of Hebron that as long as they stayed in their homes, they would be safe. But that day, he just, he was mounted on a horse, walking around as these riots were taking place. Many of his Arab policemen were taking part in the riots, or just standing outside of Jewish homes and watching as these, women, men, and children were slaughtered. And it was only when the mob turned their sights on the British police chief that he finally decided to fire his gun. And soon after he did that, the rioters dispersed. He ended up killing a few rioters, and the British arrested hundreds of suspects in the weeks after the riots throughout Palestine. Many of them were released. Those who were sentenced, almost all of them had their convictions overturned or shortened. For example, the sheikh, the Islamic official in Hebron who had led the riots, he had been sentenced, I think, to a few years in prison, and he ended up serving, I think, a month in prison, and he went right back to serving in his role as the leading Muslim official in Hebron. The British ended up executing 3 Arab men. 2 of them, I believe, were 2 of the worst perpetrators of the massacre in Hebron. Another one had taken part in the massacre in Sfat. And these men were executed the following year in 1930. And to this day, the Palestinian Martyrs' Day, that is honored by the Palestinian government and Palestinians throughout the world every year, is on that day.
Interesting.
June 30th. And it's on that day because this was these were essentially, the original martyrs of the Palestinian cause. And one of the things that has been most illuminating to me since the book was published is, I don't think many Palestinians are reading my book, but I have a very close Palestinian friend who read the book, and he said that growing up, he had no idea that these three men who they honor as heroes in Palestinian society, he was taught that they had fought the British and that this is why they were heroes and that this is why they're martyrs who are, revered in Palestinian society. He had no idea until reading my book the truth behind why those men were killed and what they had actually done.
Yeah, the education system, taught by the Palestinian government and Hamas and all the powers that control the people over there is very, very toxic and full of lies and misinformation and always vilifying Jews and Israelis. That's why it's happening. I mean, it's been happening for decades.
And now it's happening not just in...
Yeah, unfortunately, now it's everywhere else.
It's everywhere. And now that same indoctrination and disinformation is so rampant and prevalent throughout the West and in the US. It's horrifying.
Yeah, and it's the same points that they deliver to their people. They now send it to all over the world and have their people going in communities and college campuses and all these places to infiltrate and teach them these lies. And it's interesting that it's easier to believe lies than the truth. In a way, I don't know what are the human brain, how it works in that way, but it's very interesting to see, and it's sad.
Yeah.
And you spoke before, but you mentioned something about the people in Hebron didn't think their neighbors are going to go against them, and it's the same thing that happened on October 7th in the kibbutzim, because a lot of them were friends with Palestinians. They had Palestinians working for them. They helped them go to medical appointments and all these things, and they didn't think that anything like that would happen. And unfortunately, it happened. And I know a lot of them said that, especially those that were, held in captivity, they said that their views completely shifted, obviously, after that.
Yeah.
Some still kept their beliefs, but a lot of them just changed their minds, and they realized that they had to wake up. And this is not, unfortunately, it's not what they thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. So did you get to speak to Israelis and Palestinians after October 7th? And if so, what were your impressions of that compared to what you knew about how people behaved after 1929 massacre?
So I spoke to various Israelis after October 7th because the book takes us through October 7th. So, it starts in the 1920s, but it ends in the post-October 7th world. And so I interviewed family members of hostages in Gaza, survivors from the kibbutzim in southern Israel, and I interviewed Palestinians who I had already, spoken to for the book. And, it wasn't those conversations that illuminated the parallels between the aftermath of 1929 and the aftermath of October 7th. It was really seeing the global, just the shocking reaction from around the world of people, justifying the massacre or saying that Israel had actually killed Israelis in southern Israel, not Hamas, despite the fact that Hamas had live streamed their attack.
Yeah.
And it was just really just mind-boggling to watch history repeat itself again, in the same way that the atrocities that occurred in 1929 had also been carried out on October 7th, the slaughter, the rapes, the castration, all of these horrific things, the simultaneous denial and victim blaming was also mirroring 1929. So in the aftermath of the massacre, Arab leaders, Arabs living in Palestine tried to claim that they had not committed massacres anywhere, that it was Jews who had actually carried out these attacks. In Hebron, they claimed that the yeshiva students had killed their fellow Jews in Hebron to raise funds from the diaspora for their yeshiva. They claimed that Jews had actually initiated the riots in Jerusalem by attacking Muslim worshipers. I mean, all of this was false. And the fascinating, or depressing aspect of that is that I was reading the newspaper, reporting, and the articles in the New York Times. I mean, these riots were front page news on every newspaper, in the New York Times, the Times of London, Baltimore News. I mean, across the board, these riots in Palestine were front page news for days, and that then they were being portrayed more accurately, more honestly, than the way many news organizations reported in the aftermath of October 7th. So in the aftermath of 1929, of the massacre in 1929, when Arab leaders and Arabs in Palestine were denying or shifting blame, journalists and newspapers were depicting those claims as lies, as utter lies. They were claiming, they're denying this. And it was very clear to someone reading the newspaper what was true and what was false, versus in the aftermath of October 7th, so many of the claims, someone reading the newspaper would have no idea which side is telling the truth and which side is lying, because they're just placed on the same pedestal. Claims from Hamas, claims from Israel, they're both claims. There's no truth. It's up to the reader, to the news consumer, to decide which side they're on. And that's how they decide which facts
Right. I feel like in the past, there was more integrity from journalists, and nowadays it's more about the clicks and likes that you get on social media, or how, what's your ratings for tonight for the news, or who's going to read your newspaper, rather than giving the people the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's also that so many of the people working at news organizations go into their job with this idea that they need to bring justice, and to them, they are on the side of free Palestine. They believe, they have succumbed to a lot of this disinformation themselves, and so they see their purpose as not just delivering all of the facts, but delivering facts in a way that will hurt one side and help the other. Right. And so any fact, any detail that lifts up one cause at the expense of the other, that is how they're making their decisions. That is why, so many of the aspects of this war that we know, such as, Hamas using Palestinian homes, and Hezbollah doing the same, building tunnels under civilian homes and schools, as a deliberate maneuver, a deliberate strategy to either get Israel to not attack, or to have Israel attack and kill, many civilians. And this is their strategy. And yet you would not know that from reading.
Right. It's a lot of personal agenda. I feel like a lot of journalists insert their personal opinions about things, or what they want to happen. They don't really care to tell the story as it is.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's one journalist that I interviewed here on the podcast, Yotam Confino. He's from Denmark, but I really respect him in that way, that he's Jewish. He lives in Israel on and off, but he tells the story as it is. Right. He has a lot of integrity as a journalist, and he was fired from his job because of that, because he wouldn't go the other way. He wouldn't be against Israel. So it's interesting to see the difference in journalism, but I feel like there's lack of integrity nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So going back to your book, now that it's been optioned into film, how did that happen, and what was the process like? And also, how will that compare? Like, how did it go between the book and the film? Because it's a very different format, obviously.
Yeah. So I'm super excited about it. Of course, I, you know, was hoping that would happen because I do feel like this story is so cinematic and
Mhm.
David is a captivating character. And yeah, just kind of, it took some time. It was about a year after the book was published that I was contacted by a producer who had read the book and loved it and said he wanted to adapt it. And I met with him. I really loved his vision and where he was coming from with it. And this was around the time that the film Palestine 36 was generating a lot of
Mm.
buzz.
Yeah.
That film was nominated for an Oscar. It is a complete distortion of history. It
Yeah.
seems to be a film about the 1936 Palestinian revolt against the British, but it tells a completely false version of what actually happened during those riots. The author of the book Palestine 1936, to which that film is completely unrelated. He wrote, Oren Kessler is his name. He wrote a great piece for the Free Press outlining all of the ways in which this film is a complete rewriting of history.
Mhm.
And so that was one of the reasons the producer actually wanted to make a film about 1929, because he felt that, we have to portray history as it was, not as
Right.
what we want it to have been. And so he went out looking for a book about the massacre of 1929 to better inform him of that history. And he found my book, and yeah, it's very early stages, so we haven't, filming has not started or anything. But I'm really looking forward to the process.
Do you have any hopes for the film? Like, are there any actors that you would like to participate in the film, or is there any way, a specific way that you would like them to show the story?
Um, I mean, I really just hope, and I think it will do this, that it really brings to life what Hebron was before the massacre, and what life was like in Palestine for Jews and Arabs during the British Mandate, showing kind of what could have been had the forces of extremism and jihadism not completely co-opted the Arab population of Palestine. I mean, I don't use the word Palestinians because at that time, Palestinians were everyone living in Palestine. There were Jews, Arabs. David, his letters, he wrote them Hebron, Palestine. And when he would write about Jews living in Hebron who had been born there, he called them Palestinians. The Arabs of Palestine didn't really call themselves Palestinians at that time. They just
Yeah,
called
that
themselves
was just coined
Arabs.
later on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I just hope that people watching the film will gain a deeper understanding of what was and how different it is from what they've been told,
Yeah.
and that more people will come to know about this massacre, because again, it's so unknown outside of Israel, and yet it's such a pivotal point in Jewish history, in the history of pre-state Israel. It's so crucial to understanding the conflict, and again, to any hopes of resolving it.
Yeah. So what are your hopes for the future? Because I mean, knowing everything you know about then and everything that's been happening in recent years, what are your hopes for the future? Do you think there's a way to bridge that, to make things better for everybody in Israel and Gaza and everybody around the area?
I do have hope. I think we have to have hope. Otherwise, I mean, we're just saying that we accept the idea that we are just going to be stuck in this never-ending story of massacres and wars. And as an Israeli, I'm sure you grew up with the idea, well, hopefully when I have kids, they won't have to serve in the army. We won't have to defend ourselves from never-ending
Yeah.
wars. And there's a bit of, you have to also be realistic. Like, we're not
Right.
going to be able to end all of our enemies' desires to wipe Israel off the map. That's not going to end, and it's certainly not going to end overnight. I also don't believe in the idea of, negotiating a two-state solution now, forcing the two sides together. I think that's why a two-state solution has never been reached, because the work needs to be done from the ground up in encouraging Palestinians and their leaders to actually want peace. And there's never been a Palestinian leader. There have only been 3 Palestinian leaders: the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who incited the riots of 1929, his cousin Yasser Arafat, who kind of took over, in his shoes, and of course Mahmoud Abbas. All of them have rejected every offer of a Palestinian state since 1937. So the only way we'll achieve peace is when Palestinians want peace. And so for them to want peace, you need to not only have leaders who want peace, but you need to have a different education system that is teaching them that peace is something that you would want to attain. And sadly, generations of Palestinians have been taught the exact opposite, that Israel is a stain, an affront to Islam. It needs to be eradicated. All of their suffering derives from the existence of Israel. I mean, all of these things that, if you're raised in that education, of course you're going to want to, when
you're being brainwashed since birth.
Right. So that, that needs to change. The education system in the Palestinian education system, and the UNRWA system needs to be completely reformed. And Palestinians who seek peace and who advocate for a two-state solution, those Palestinians do exist, and they need to be elevated and empowered so they don't have to fear for their lives, so they can create movements within their society that will enable them to overcome the immense backlash and intimidation they face. Because if they're not being empowered to speak their minds and to create change, they're never going to win over in the face of the overwhelming forces that prefer continued war and destruction. And so I think that the only way we'll see a different reality a century from now is if those two things happen. If the resources of the countries and leaders who claim to want peace, if they put those resources behind Palestinian peace seekers and force the Palestinian government, the Palestinian Authority, to reform their education system, to end the pay to slay program. None of this is easy and won't happen overnight, but I don't see why more people aren't willing to put their hope behind that rather than just saying, well, we're just doomed.
I think it's when it happens for so many years, and this is what you live through. And I mean, you mentioned Israelis, gotten used to it and all that. We had a song in 1973. It was like, "We're the children of summer of '73," and in the song, like, it's a very popular song in Israel for decades. This is like something that we sing during Yom HaZikaron. You say, like, the hopes that my children are not going to have to do that. But they do every time. Still to this day. And I feel like you become cynical in a way after all those years and going through all these things, that you're like, yes, I want peace, I want hope, but is it going to happen? I don't know. It's been way too long, and it sucks, but this is their reality. Unfortunately, this is what we live with. And now seeing the West behaving the way it behaves right now, it's very, I don't know. Hope, you always have hope, because without hope, what's left?
Exactly.
But it's hard to see it happening with everything.
Of course. No, and it's not the responsibility of the average Israeli to do these things, but
right.
I wish we had better leaders who were more ambitious and more hopeful and more optimistic and more courageous in trying to create a different future for us and our children and grandchildren, and not just Israeli leaders, but of course, Western leaders. Again, there's so many politicians, lawmakers around the world for whom resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or ending Palestinian suffering, or bringing peace and a two-state solution is supposedly very important to them. And I wish they understood that so much of the focus they are putting on, Israel and, opposing Israel, if they put even a fraction of that energy into trying to actually improve the foundations on the ground for the emergence of a Palestinian state, for the emergence of true leaders, we would already be in a much better place, even if just a fraction of that energy was put into that.
Yeah, there's no way that anything good is going to happen with the current leaders that they have. It's just not,
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, all right. Well, where can people get your book and learn more about it?
Anywhere. You can order it on Amazon. You can get it at your local bookstore. If they don't carry it, you can ask them to carry it. But yeah, if you want, the easiest way is on Amazon, but you can get it, anywhere, Barnes and Noble, wherever. And if you want to support my work, you can go to my website, yardenaschwartz.com. I have a free newsletter. I do book talks across the country. I still am a journalist writing articles. So if you want to see my work, you can just see it all on my website, yardenaschwartz.com.
All right, Yardena. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Esti. It was really great.
And thank you all for listening. See you next season.